Yesterday, there was palpable excitement when news broke that President Muhammadu Buhari had signed the Petroleum Industry Bill into law. In so doing, he broke the jinx that had prevented the enactment of the oil industry legislation for 13 years. However, Buhari, who doubles as the Minister of Petroleum Resources, cannot afford to rest on his oars, as he will now have to contend with the difficult task of implementing the provisions of the Petroleum Industry Act of 2021. Some key tasks include the establishment of the Nigerian Upstream Regulatory Commission and the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Regulatory Authority, transfer of personnel to the two new industry regulators, and the appointment of executive personnel to run them. A bigger task is the corporatization of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC, into a limited liability company, the termination of the assets and liabilities that will be assigned to the new NNPC Limited, and how to dispose of the stranded assets and liabilities that will not be absorbed by the emerging entity. To discuss the key highlights of the PIA and the onerous task of implementing the new legal governance, regulatory, and fiscal framework for the oil and gas sector, we are now being joined by Gbite Adeniji. Adeniji is an energy lawyer and managing partner at the law firm ENR Advisory. He also served as technical advisor to the former Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, Dr. Ibe Kachukwu. Good morning, Gbite Adeniji, and thank you for joining us on the morning show.
Thank you.
Good morning.
For having me
Thank you
here.
very much
Good morning.
indeed. Yes, very quickly. We need you to help us unpack this new law, the Petroleum Industry Act 2021, which has been in the making for about 2 decades, particularly with regard to the key highlights, the future of the NNPC, its new status, and then the concern expressed in the papers today. This day talks about how this is a watershed moment. How is it in that regard? And other papers are talking about, well, petrol may sell for 300 naira, federal government to decide on a subsidy. You are the expert. We will just listen.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. Let me start firstly by congratulating the president for driving his team to resolve what has been almost a generational embarrassment to the country. The mere process of introducing petroleum legislation. This bill is very important for the country. It's less a bill for petroleum sector reform. It's important for that, but more importantly, it's a bill. It's an economic bill, and that's for me. That's the key takeaway we all need to understand about this bill, because what it does is that it opens the petroleum sector up, right, to a new wave of opportunities. We now have the basis for deregulating the downstream. We can cut away all the subsidies that we have completely mismanaged in the last 20 or more years. Redirect some of that towards more useful social and economic needs in the country. It also creates the opportunity for leveraging on Nigeria's main abundance, natural resource abundance, which is natural gas. Because if you look at the bill, it's got provisions galore on natural gas. And this is the first time ever that we actually have provisions dealing with that endowment. So when you think of the energy transition, if you have clarity around the legislative framework for gas, I think that basically positions Nigeria, right, for that future. Think about the size of Nigeria's population today. They need to move quickly, right, into a gas-based industrialization. This is what that bill does. In addition to that, it addresses the sore issue around environmental regulation in the oil industry. Again, many provisions addressing environmental laws, both in the upstream and in the midstream and downstream. That's very important. It pitches very well towards that. Then also, there's also the other issue, which is now very important. Because as you liberalize the industry, you also need laws that contains the potential, right, for abusers, right, of monopoly positions, right? Now, the industry has a number of monopoly operators currently, including the National Oil Company, as a matter of fact, but then there are also others as well. So if you look at the bill, you will see many provisions regarding economic regulation. That's really, really important. And that's why I say it's an economic bill in many respects.
Well, you just referred to the benefits of cutting subsidy, which we all know. I mean, you're preaching to the converted. But does the political will to actually bite the bullet exist, especially now with the economic hardships that Nigerians are facing?
Okay. The fact that the executive has presented a bill, right, that effectively does away with subsidies, right, demonstrates there's political will. Right? It's now a matter of law that the sector must liberalize. So if it's law, then there's statutory duty, right, to move away from subsidies. So we then have to now see how they set up the regulatory agencies in the bill to see how they now actually go about implementing their mandate, which is to see that the wholesale transactions in terms of petroleum products they're taken in a willing buyer, willing seller basis, as opposed to the way we've done things currently.
Well, passage is one thing, enforcement is quite another.
Well, the law is the law, and what it does, it gives potentially any one of Nigeria's 200 million people or 774 local governments the rights to actually file an action, right, to require the agencies, right, to undertake their statutory duties.
Okay.
Right.
Rufai?
Okay, sir?
Yes.
Yeah. Great to have you, sir. Real quickly, I want to talk about, how workable is it going to be now that the NNPC will be unbundled? That's to be done in 6 months according to the Act. It's not an Act, it's now an Act. And the minister will oversee that. A lot of people are arguing that this makes the minister deserve the petroleum industry in Nigeria. He's so powerful. This bill has given him more powers. How will it break this up? What will be the workability? Because we are going to have the Upstream Commission, we are going to have the Midstream and Downstream Commission and the likes and all of that. How is that going to work? And the unbundling of the NNPC?
Well, the minister functionally must lead the process of reforming the industry. That's a given. Also, the minister, if you recall, the minister is the chairman of the corporation, so he will lead that process. It's not just a matter of unbundling NNPC, he's also been in charge of all the other implementation tasks that must be undertaken under the PIB. So basically, the minister then must have the team put behind him, well, he must have basically assembled the team around him to do this work. Typically, there would be the appointment of some very experienced management consultants, and there's more than enough capacity in the country around this to support this process, to see to the proper design of the new National Oil Company, which the law envisages. If 6 months might be a tall order, because you also need to be able to do the assessment of all the assets of the corporation, unpack the assets that are not that are tangential to the future of the new National Oil Company, pack them aside, and then wrap around the issue of the liabilities to another section. But his mandate is very clear, which is basically to lead that process.
Well, very quickly, let's focus a little bit more on the unbundling of NNPC. Some companies are going to come out of regulatory authorities, and then NNPC itself will become a limited liability company. And there's been this talk about assets and liabilities, right? And the new NNPC will operate as a limited liability company under CAMA rules, right?
Yes.
So there will be talk about assets and liabilities.
Yes.
Part of these liabilities will be these refineries on which the federal government is investing for the purposes of rehabilitation billions of dollars. Now, if that is the case, if the new NNPC inherits those liabilities, how will they be able to compete as a limited liability company?
Well, let me first say that the refineries are part of the operating assets, right, of the corporation, right? Yes, indeed, there's been work in the last few months, right, to ensure these refineries get off the ground again. The refineries will come with their liabilities, certainly. But if the...
But the assets you talk about,
Yes.
they're loss-making assets.
At this point in time, correct. At this point in time, they are loss-making. In fact, they're non-operational and they have a huge amount of debt on them, certainly. But once they start operating, right, then we now reverse the process of importing fuels into the country. So basically, you then start plugging that hole, right, of importation. Then you now start supplying into domestic Nigeria, and then you now have the potential of supplying wider into the region, right, and to other markets. That is the theory of it all. So that potential exists. Now, the key issue then will now be the quality of the management, right, around these refineries, and the quality of management, even the wider corporation itself, to have the right strategies around what would happen when these refineries get on the ground. You've got to basically wipe out the backlog of the debt around the refineries through exports and domestic supply.
Now, what's your take on some of the controversies that are sort of bedeviling this passage? Even though the president has been congratulated, there's a lot of criticism. The verdict is in, according to PDP, PANDEF, and IJC, saying that they're condemning the assent. The president has not demonstrated that he's a listening leader. A lot of this is to do with that 3%. It's quite scandalous in some opinions that's, devoted to the host communities. The original bill contained a provision of 10%, in spite of the fact that the GMD of NNPC has said that the host communities are looking at $500 million, which is an awful lot of money. But in relative terms, it still remains 3%. Should they have had a bigger, slice of the cake?
I think the argument is misplaced, to be honest. Right. What's enough? Now that is a big question. You're sitting on the executive desk, and someone says, "Give me 10%." Well, would 20% be enough? The big issue is this: when you look at what has been done with the host community funding, is that all the operators have now been basically given an obligation, right, to get more in the development of the Niger Delta. Okay, and that's now a statutory mandate on them. That mandate wasn't there before. It was typically a contractual arrangement based by basically suasion and social obligation and all that. But now this is statutory. Now this is a step change from what we had previously. Secondly, when you think about it, that 3%, or whatever percentile they might have wanted, right, it's actually derivation through the back door. That's the reality of it, okay? Right, so it's a difficult political issue, right, that this bill was trying to address with respect to host communities. It might have helped if the necklace had been grasped by actually looking at the Constitution, tweaking the derivation funding, right, to the host communities. And then it's a big region. That's number one. But also you also have to consider that potentially there could be a constitutional challenge, right, to this host community funding, as there could be to a few other provisions in the bill. Right, the bill is not a perfect bill. Right, it solves a number of problems, but also opens up new ones as well. And this is one of them, this issue of the 3% funding for those communities. But I think it's more than enough. I would have preferred if the issue of the NDDC, right, had been tackled head on. The NDDC has proven to be a failure for the Niger Delta. It needed significant reform. I'm not sure that the current attempts that's been done is the answer. If that had been looked at properly, then perhaps that's where some of that funding should have been directed, but with a better structure around it.
Rufai.
Right. So the GMD of NNPC, Melikere was on a Rise News night yesterday night, and he talked about, the commencement of the transformation process, of the NNPC under PIA, under the new PIA regime. And he was also talking about the fact that, they were going to set up an implementation committee. What do you expect to see from that committee?
Well, it will be, I expect to see a cross-agency representation because when you look at the bill, you see how people are going to be moved wholesale from one existing agency to the new agencies. There'll be issues around, there'll be sensitivities around the existing terms for the staff. Pensions, for instance, will be a big issue. Fortunately, the law speaks to that, but people will basically be concerned about their positions and their emoluments and all that. So you're going to see a fair amount of senior representation from each of the existing agencies in that committee. But I hope that also they would also seek external support because this is basically about restructuring, restructuring of MDAs in the government and their models around the world around how this happens. So I expect that they will seek the right sort of support to assist them in this whole process, more especially in the minister's office, because what I know of government is that there might be some capacity issues around that level. So you got basically to seek some proper resourcing to help you through that process.
Okay, let's talk about the fiscal framework for gas under the PIA with regard to domestic gas supply, which is something the IOCs are not happy with. What do you think, and how do we incentivize them so that they can buy into this domestic gas supply proposition as defined under the law?
I think, first of all, we have to not shy away as a country from requiring anyone that has the privilege of exploring for and producing resources in this country to help contribute to the country's development. The issue of gas development is crucial to Nigeria's future. So the requirement that every producer contributes part of their resources to the domestic economy, which is domestic gas supply obligation, right, is fundamentally sound. So we don't need to be shy about it. The question is how you compensate that activity, right? So when you look at the bill, you'll see how they are provided for fixed pricing, right, for the gas that is supplied into the domestic economy. This is almost like basically grandfathering the existing arrangements, right, with some tweaks. Fortunately, it's a transitional arrangement because, again, there's a signal, right, to ultimate willing buyer, willing seller arrangement, and that's good, right? How we get there very quickly, right, really is the trick. So you'll see when you go to the fiscal provisions, you see how government is trying to just move all the players along. And I really don't like to think of this in relation to IOCs against domestic producers. Every producer is a producer, whether you're IOC or whether you're domestic. Okay, so let's get past that. So, but I think the fiscal provisions for gas are actually exciting. Let's start first with the provisions around the midstream. One of the biggest problems around the gas sector has been the issue of infrastructure. The PIB soundly addresses that by providing a fantastic fiscal regime, right, for infrastructure, in the sense that basically you have a tax holiday that's almost like a 10-year tax holiday. And the idea being that if you're anywhere and you want to make an investment in infrastructure, you want to say, you know what, I would like to be in Nigeria because I'm not going to pay tax for 10 years. I mean, I like that. First of all, there's a 5-year tax holiday and an additional 5 years. That's what PIB says. So that's very good. Next, the fiscal incentives for the upstream and also pretty good fiscal incentives also for midstream and downstream operators. they've taken coordinates from the commitment of government and policy that Nigeria needs to get into gas-based industrialization. And I think the PIB roundly addresses that. I don't expect anyone should be complaining about gas or gas-based fiscal incentives and all that. The key issue is basically the pricing. Let's get quickly to a point where we get to willing buyer, willing seller arrangements.
What's your take on the roadmap for that, implementation of the transfer of personnel from the current regulators that we have, the PPPRA, DPR, to the new Upstream Regulatory Commission, the Downstream and Midstream regulatory authorities? How long do you think that process will take, and do you think that it's going to be seamless?
It can be seamless. Definitely, there'll be turbulence around it, without any doubt in my mind. So there's a promise in the bill that all jobs will be saved. Okay, so it'll be old wine in a bottle. But the process, if I recollect, will take about 18 months. Okay, the question basically is who's going to the midstream, who's going to the downstream authority, who's going to be in what position. That's really where the jostling will be. So expect that there'll be some backroom trading. There'll be pressure from the potentates. This is typical in Nigeria. Let's cut to the chase. That's how Nigeria works. The big point is for the minister, which is the president, to be resolute. We need to have the agencies created for the regulation of the industry, right, to be properly staffed, which means basically, the first thing you need to first design the structure of the agencies, right, and make sure that anyone put in a position truly merits that position. If that is not done, this PIB will be basically not worth a piece of paper is written on, I promise you, because it's all about implementation. The vision is big, which is basically to transform the economy of the country, right, through the petroleum industry. But you've got to run the industry now competently. So if you hold back, right, on putting competent people in these very important positions, the country will be in problem, definitely. And you will achieve your vision.
Rufai.
All right. I'd like to talk about, real quickly, tax regime, hydrocarbon taxes. What's going to be the dispensation of the new tax regime under the PIB?
I'm sorry, Mr. What's going to be the
hydrocarbon taxes? What's going to be the
tax regime?
Yes.
The hydrocarbon
law.
Yes.
Yeah.
What will it be like?
Well, basically, that basically works largely around crude oil. So the thinking is basically that there should be a tax on crude oil production, and also there'll be a separate tax for gas. So if you produce gas and you sell it down into the midstream and downstream, that'll be covered by the company's income tax side, which is the lower tax band. Now, if you produce oil, right, you'll be charged an hydrocarbon tax, right, and also another tax, which is CETA. But the effective tax rate ultimately is lower than what we have currently.
Okay, we have many of these laws.
Yes.
The major challenge we've had, no matter how good a piece of legislation is, the test is in the implementation.
Yes.
Always.
Now, from what you know, do you think that there is the political will to put this revolutionary piece of legislation into action? You have talked about how it will address monopoly. You have talked about the role of potentates. You've talked about proper recruitment and staffing of the various agencies. From what you know about Nigeria, do you think that really the revolution that we expect could happen and that there is the political way to put this to work?
Well, that's a very difficult question. The best way I can respond to it is as follows. We made a big, big step by enacting this legislation. Now, that's political will, number one. It's a big tick around that. The next issue now, right, is to ensure, right, that the appointments are done without undue favoritism. You've got to now pitch to competence, competent regulation. typically when you enact new sector legislation, you go through an initial period where there's regulatory risk. Now you compound that risk, right, if you don't have competent people on the table to engage with those who are going to engage with the law, which is the operators, or even new investors, right? Remember, part of this also is to bring in new investment. So if there is the perception around competent regulation, then the desired investment is likely to be hindered. Okay, so it's very important, right, that there's that understanding at the level of the presidency that we're at a very delicate point now with respect to the global oil industry. We're literally in the last quartile of the oil industry as we know it today. So it's incumbent on Nigeria, right, to take this shot, which is almost counterintuitive to a national culture, competent management. I'm sorry, it's a controversial statement, but I need to make it, right? We must, this time around, right, sort this issue out. Because, as I said, the PIB is an economic bill. So you want to make sure that the management of the sector, right, is in solid hands to help steer Nigeria out of trouble. We're heading towards the big trouble. By the 2030s, the oil industry, as we know it, would have radically transformed. So we need to have sector regulators that can basically drag us, everybody kicking and screaming, right, out of harm's way. And it takes a high level of understanding, right, of the global context, right, of the policy context, of the objectives, right, to be able to do that. You can't have lightweights run the industry going forward, in my mind.
Well, under the Act, the NNPC will no longer get funding from the federal government for its joint venture operations.
Yes.
So where will NNPC now, seek funding? How will they raise it?
That's a very difficult one. So the law says very clearly that NNPC will no longer have recourse to government funding. But NNPC is sitting on trillions of dollars of assets as a corporation. It needs to be able to leverage on those assets, right, to raise funds in the global markets. Now, this has also come at a time when most of the development and international financial institutions are moving away from funding fossil fuel projects. I suspect that there will be a lot of interest in funding gas projects. I'm not sure how NNPC is going to go around raising funds for its many oil projects, except its partners are willing to come to the table. And even they have their problems as well. As I said, a lot is changing. In fact, you tend to think that this PIB actually has come later than it should, really, because had we resolved this issue a few years back, we wouldn't be in these headwinds. We're right in the middle of the maelstrom right now with regards to funding of oil projects or oil sector projects at global level. Many of the industrialized nations, many of the financial institutions are rapidly changing their policies, right, and moving towards renewables. This is going to be a real challenge. Perhaps it would have helped if there had been the possibility of an IPO in the bill. Even that takes 3, 4, 5 years to prepare for. What the law says is that NNPC shares can be sold on a competitive basis and all that, but I'm not sure that that is the answer for that fundraising. An IPO would have helped significantly.
Well, on that note, let's take a short break. After the break, we'll come back to you. Please stay with us. And the conversation with Gbite Adeniji will continue. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the morning show here on the Arise News channel. Our guest is still Gbite Adeniji, an energy lawyer and managing partner at the law firm ENR Advisory. And he's been helping us to unpack the Petroleum Industry Act 2021, signed into law, PIB signed into law by President Muhammadu Buhari. Rufai, over to you.
All right, two quick questions. Number one will be, what's your take on the fact that this act is silent on the case of insecurity in the Niger Delta? Insecurity has reduced the output of oil out of the Niger Delta, and we're hearing nothing, as regards provision for insecurity in the Niger Delta. Secondly, the law talks about corporate governance, applications for corporate governance, how this will be applied. I mean, what would be the framework like for corporate governance? Because we know a government parastatals and the fact that the workings of the NNPC now will be like a private company under Karma, they don't understand the culture of corporate governance.
Okay. I think it would be wrong for the legislation that basically addresses industry reform to now start addressing things to do with security. Security is a completely different thing. There are many reasons why there's insecurity in Niger Delta. And there's insecurity all over the country as well. So you can't have the bill having provisions to deal with this. This is something that the police, the army, and also even governance at, when I talk about governance, I'm talking about country governance, economic management, macroeconomic management, management by local government, management by state governments, address social and economic justice. So this is not a matter for the PIB. It would have been extremely wrong to see that in the bill. Okay, so that's one. On the issue of corporate governance, well, let's cut NNPC Limited, the new corporation. Let's cut them a slack. Let's cut them some slack rather. There's a new board. When you look at the composition of the board, you have more independent board members than executive members of a corporation, right, on the board. So that structure basically is designed to ensure better governance of the corporation. Will they achieve it? Time will tell. It probably would have been better if there had been a specific incorporation of the corporate governance rules of the Nigerian Stock Exchange into the law, basically mandating that the NNPC be subject to those rules in terms of corporate governance. That would have helped. But perhaps the new board will swim on its own steam, incorporate those rules into its management. But to the fact that the corporation now comes under KAMA, there is some level of governance requirements, even in KAMA. But I guess there's still some room for adjustment in there, definitely. But I expect a better run corporation than what we've had historically. Time will tell, I suppose. The jury will be out for quite a while on the new corporation.
Okay, I mean, there are persons who have criticized the PIA as it is.
Yes.
They say it's not radical enough, particularly with regard to the future status of the NNPC. The recommendation in that regard is that perhaps there should have been specific provisions in the Act providing for the future privatization of the NNPC, like its listing on the Nigerian Stock Exchange or on other stock exchanges around the world. What do you think of that?
Well, to be frank, I thought the bill was rather conservative around the NNPC. The first thing you need to understand about the NNPC is that there are very solid people in that corporation, but they constantly invaded, right, by, again, the potentates, right, of the country. There's a country of big men, too many big men. Obas, Obis, mayors, there are all sorts of big men around the corporation. So what you needed to do was to basically insulate the corporation from all that. Right, so one would have wanted to see provisions that basically provide for a bit more independence, right, of the corporation. Provisions that allows the corporation to be able to get into the stock exchange, do its listing, because it needs funding, and that's a fundamental issue. It needs funding. That wasn't there. I'd rather have that listing than privatization, really. Because, again, our history of privatization has not been stellar. We've bungled, to be frank, we've bungled many privatizations in the past. We've politicized them. A listing would have opened you to a wider net of investors. And if you wanted to do a listing, then the design of the corporation would have needed to be a bit more radical than what we have currently. So I do agree, it is conservative. Yeah.
Okay. Tonto?
Okay, my question, but I'd just like to say before I ask my actual question, just by way of a comment, the listing of a privately held company, is that not a form of privatization?
Trying to understand what I'm trying to achieve. I'm looking for something that allows a wider net of investors. When you list, you're immediately subject to certain rules that affect your behavior, that affect your governance, that affect the way in which you run the corporation. When you privatize, it might just well be that just a new investor comes into you. You don't necessarily are subject to those rules that a listing might have provided to you. And if you list, not necessarily only in Nigeria, you could also do a cross-listing, which takes you to other stock exchanges, right? Which again opens you to a wider pool of funding. Because fundamentally, you look for funding and also look for governance. So listing gives you that opportunity, whereas privatization doesn't necessarily do so.
Right.
That's the essential difference.
So I do have another question. I'm taking you back to allocations. I apologize again.
Sure.
And this issue, what is your perspective on the criticisms around the Frontier Exploration Fund and that 30% of NNPC Limited's profits to be allocated to that?
That's a very interesting question. Okay, I'm trying not to be sentimental around this issue because there's a lot of sentiment behind it. Let's look at it from 3 or 4 perspectives. First of all, there are many terrains in Nigeria that are still frontier. In the south, in the middle belt, in northern Nigeria. You can take data coming from the CIA fact sheet. Just go into Google CIA fact sheet. Nigeria is reputed to potentially have 600 million standard cubic feet of gas, which we haven't discovered yet. We discovered 203 million standard cubic feet, accidentally. But it's reputed to have potentially 600 million. There's a possibility that you could actually find gas in Kano or in Kwara. Nigeria is that country that's sitting on, an ocean of gas. If gas is the future, let's go find it. What's the amount of the Frontier Exploration Fund? It's nothing, really, when you consider that potential. Now, what you actually need to worry about are the following. The management of the fund. So if we want to go exploit frontier business, let's do it properly. That's number one. Secondly, potentially any one of the 774 local governments, yours in Bagura, potentially could find an action and say, well, I'm sorry, this provision is unconstitutional. So that really, right, is where the real problem is. Could it have been done another way? You need to appropriate to take money, right, petroleum revenues earned, right, and now sequestrate it, or in more technical parlance, earmark. This is earmarking. You can't earmark the way they've earmarked in the bill. So I suppose, I'm hoping that they will actually correct that position, right, by going to the National Assembly when the time comes for the budgetary process and actually ask for the money to be appropriated for the Frontier Exploration Fund. Otherwise, it will be challenged successfully, in my view.
Okay, well, at this point, we'd like to thank you very much. And I guess you are very right about the frontier business. Yes. Because they're thinking, when people hear about the basins,
Yes.
they think it's only in the northern part
No,
of
it's
the
everywhere.
country. There's the Anambra Basin.
Correct.
There's the Benue Trough. There is the Sokoto Basin.
Yes.
There is the Gongola Basin. You know, but I guess, you know, what the government needs to do is to do more work to explain this Petroleum Industry Act
Correct.
to the Nigerian people.
Absolutely.
And if there is any need for further amendments, we'll now have the opportunity to move on that score. Thank you very much for joining
It's been a pleasure
us.
indeed. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
having me. Thank you.